Welcome, weary time traveller, to our whimsical journey through the missteps and misadventures of medieval invention. As you settle in for a night of restful repose, we invite you to ponder the peculiarities of the past from the comfort of your own bed. Before we begin our tale, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let us know. And if you find yourself enjoying these calm, historical musings, we humbly suggest hitting that subscribe button so you never miss a chance to boring yourself to sleep with the oddities of yesteryear. Now, let us set the stage. The Middle Ages, a time of great advances in art, science and philosophy. But amidst the soaring cathedrals and groundbreaking ideas, there lurked a host of questionable creations. Inventions that, in hindsight, seem more suited to a court jester's repertoire than a scholar's workshop. Tonight, we'll be your guide through some of the most bizarre, impractical, and downright silly devices ever dreamt up by medieval minds. Our story begins in the shadow of the Black Death. As the plague swept across Europe in the 14th century, it left a grim mark on the medieval psyche. Death was everywhere, and people began to confront their own mortality in increasingly macabre ways. One of the most striking examples of this was the rise of the danse macabre motif in art. Picture this: frescoes adorning the walls of churches and graveyards, depicting skeletons and corpses merrily dancing alongside the living. It was the original dark humour, a grim reminder that death comes for us all, regardless of status or station. These morbid masterpieces were the work of unknown artists who sought to capture the spirit of their times. A world where life was fleeting, and the spectre of death was always just a step away. While the danse macabre may not be an invention in the traditional sense, it was undoubtedly a creation that shaped the medieval mind. It reflected a society grappling with the fragility of life and the ever-present threat of mortality. In a way, these grim frescoes were an invention of the soul, a way for people to confront their deepest fears and find a strange sort of solace in the universality of death. But the danse macabre was far from the only macabre invention to come out of the Middle Ages. Let us turn our attention now to a device that has captured the imagination of generations, even though it likely never existed in its purported form. The chastity belt. Ah yes, the chastity belt. That mythical contraption supposedly designed to keep women pure while their husbands were off fighting in the Crusades. The idea was simple: a metal girdle locked around the waist, preventing any would-be suitors from accessing the goods, as it were. It's a concept that has been perpetuated in popular culture for centuries, from bawdy medieval jokes to modern-day movies and TV shows. But here's the thing: there's no evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in medieval times. In fact, the few historical examples that do exist have been shown to be elaborate hoaxes or satirical jokes from the 15th century onwards. So where did this myth come from? It's likely that the idea of the chastity belt originated as a joke among medieval blacksmiths, a way to poke fun at the very real fears of infidelity and sexual impropriety that plagued society at the time. One can imagine a mischievous metalworker forging the first satirical chastity belt, giggling to himself as he imagined the looks on his neighbours' faces when they saw his creation. But as with so many jokes throughout history, the chastity belt took on a life of its own. It became a symbol of the oppression and control of women's bodies, a dark reminder of the ways in which society sought to police female sexuality. And yet, the fact remains that it was never a real device, just a figment of the medieval imagination that has managed to persist for centuries. Moving on from matters of the heart, or rather, the loins, let us now consider a rather peculiar piece of medieval hygiene: the ear spoon. Now, it's no secret that personal cleanliness was not exactly a top priority in the Middle Ages. Bathing was infrequent, and people often walked around covered in a layer of grime and sweat that would make modern noses wrinkle in disgust. But amidst all this filth, there was one body part that received special attention: the ears. Enter the ear spoon, also known as an ear pick, a small spoon-shaped tool used to scoop out earwax and other debris from the ear canal. These little implements were often made of precious metals like silver or gold, and were considered a symbol of wealth and status among the nobility. In fact, King Henry VIII of England was known to have a prized collection of ear spoons, which he carried with him wherever he went. One can only imagine the sight of the portly monarch digging around in his ears with a tiny golden spoon, a look of regal concentration on his face. But as amusing as the image may be, it does raise the question: why on earth did medieval people feel the need for a dedicated ear cleaning device? After all, this was a time when people rarely bathed and were perfectly content to walk around covered in all manner of grime. Why the sudden concern for ear hygiene? The answer, it seems, lies in the medieval belief that earwax was a sign of good health. According to the medical texts of the time, a buildup of wax in the ears was thought to indicate a strong constitution and a hearty immune system. As such, people were eager to show off their waxy ears as a badge of honor, and what better way to do so than with a fancy ear spoon? Of course, we now know that earwax is simply a natural byproduct of the ear's self-cleaning process, and that there's no need to go digging around in there with a spoon, or anything else for that matter. But for the medieval elite, the ear spoon was a must-have accessory, a symbol of their refined tastes and superior health. From frivolous ear-cleaning devices, we now turn to a far more macabre aspect of medieval medicine: the use of powdered mummy as a cure-all elixir. Yes, you read that right. Mummy powder, or mumia as it was known, was a highly prized substance in medieval Europe, believed to have powerful healing properties. The origins of this bizarre practice can be traced back to the Arabic medical texts of the early Middle Ages. Arab physicians believed that the bitumen used in the mummification process had medicinal qualities, and so they began prescribing ground-up mummy parts as a treatment for various ailments. This idea eventually made its way to Europe via the Crusades, and by the 14th century, mumia had become a hot commodity among European apothecaries and physicians. The demand for mummy powder was so high that it led to a thriving trade in stolen mummies, with grave robbers and thieves scouring Egyptian tombs for the precious commodity. One of the most famous proponents of mumia was Guy de La Fontaine, a royal physician to the French king, Charles VI. De La Fontaine was known to prescribe mumia for a wide range of ailments, from headaches to epilepsy to plague. But here's the thing: mumia wasn't actually made from real mummies. In fact, most of the mummy powder sold in medieval Europe was a fake, a mixture of various spices, bitumen, and even ground-up animal bones. The idea of consuming actual human remains was simply too taboo, even for the most daring of medieval doctors. Still, the fact remains that mumia was a highly sought-after substance in medieval times, a macabre testament to the lengths people were willing to go to in the name of health and healing. And while we may laugh at the absurdity of it all now, it's important to remember that medieval people were working with the best knowledge and understanding they had at the time. From the dark recesses of medieval medicine, we now turn to a rather more light-hearted invention, the mouth harp. Also known as the Jew's harp, this simple musical instrument consists of a small metal frame with a flexible tongue that the player plucks to create a twanging sound. Despite its name, the mouth harp has no particular connection to Jewish culture. The name is thought to be a corruption of jaw harp, referring to the way the instrument is held against the player's teeth. The mouth harp has a long and fascinating history, with origins stretching back to ancient Asia and references in medieval European texts dating back to the 13th century. But for all its historical significance, there's no denying that the mouth harp is a bit of a silly instrument. To play it, one must hold the frame against the teeth and pluck the tongue with a finger, creating a buzzing, twanging sound that is amplified by the mouth and jaw. It's a skill that requires a fair bit of practice and dexterity, and a willingness to look a bit foolish in the process. In fact, the silliness of the mouth harp was not lost on medieval artists and writers. In a famous drawing from 1481, Leonardo da Vinci depicted a man playing a mouth harp with a comically exaggerated expression, his cheeks puffed out and his eyes bulging as he twanged away at the tiny instrument. But for all its silliness, the mouth harp was a beloved instrument in medieval times. It was portable, easy to make, and required no formal training to play, making it the perfect instrument for travelling minstrels and wandering troubadours. And while it may not have had the grandeur of a church organ or the elegance of a lute, the mouth harp had a certain charm all its own, a whimsical reminder that music can come from the most unlikely of places. From the whimsy of the mouth harp, we now turn to a far more bizarre aspect of medieval life: the practice of putting animals on trial for crimes. Yes, you read that right. In medieval Europe, animals could be hauled into court, assigned lawyers, and even sentenced to death for their alleged misdeeds. The idea behind these animal trials was rooted in the medieval belief that all of God's creatures were subject to the same moral laws as humans. If an animal committed a crime, such as trampling a crop or killing a person, it was seen as a violation of the natural order, and the animal was held responsible for its actions. Some of the most famous animal trials of the Middle Ages involved pigs. In one case, a pig was tried and executed for the murder of a child. Other animals put on trial included rats, locusts, and even insects. In 1587, a group of weevils was tried in France for the crime of destroying a vineyard. Perhaps the most bizarre animal trial of all took place in Basel, Switzerland in 1474. The defendant in this case was a rooster who had been accused of the heinous crime of laying an egg. According to medieval superstition, a rooster laying an egg was a sign of witchcraft and devilry, and so the unfortunate bird was hauled into court to face charges. The trial was a somber affair, with the rooster represented by a court-appointed lawyer who argued passionately for the bird's innocence. In the end, however, the judge found the rooster guilty and sentenced him to death by burning at the stake, along with the offending egg, which was also condemned as an instrument of evil. Looking back on these animal trials from a modern perspective, it's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it all. But it's important to remember that for medieval people, these trials were deadly serious. They reflected a world view in which animals were seen as morally culpable beings, subject to the same laws and punishments as humans. And while we may scoff at the idea of putting a rooster on trial for laying an egg, it's worth noting that the concept of animal rights is a relatively recent one. In many ways, the medieval animal trials were a precursor to modern debates about the legal and moral status of animals, debates that continue to this day. As we near the end of our journey through the weird and wonderful world of medieval inventions, there's one more myth we need to dispel: the idea that Christopher Columbus proved the Earth was round. This is a persistent piece of historical misinformation that has been taught in schools and repeated in popular culture for generations. But it's simply not true. The reality is that educated people in the Middle Ages already knew the Earth was a globe. This knowledge had been passed down from ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle and Ptolemy, and was widely accepted in medieval universities and centers of learning. In fact, the idea of a flat Earth was more of a fringe belief, held only by a small minority of people. So why has the myth of Columbus and the flat Earth persisted for so long? The answer lies in Columbus's own self-aggrandizing accounts of his voyages. In his letters and journals, Columbus portrayed himself as a bold visionary who had to overcome the ignorance and superstition of his contemporaries in order to prove the Earth was round. But this was a deliberate distortion of the truth. Columbus was not some lone genius fighting against the tide of medieval ignorance. He was a skilled navigator and a shrewd businessman who knew how to sell himself and his ideas to potential backers. And one of the ways he did this was by exaggerating the novelty and significance of his voyages. In reality, Columbus's great innovation was not proving the Earth was round. It was his ability to convince the Spanish crown to fund his expensive and risky expeditions. He did this through a combination of charm, persistence, and outright deception. He fudged his calculations of the distance to Asia, downplayed the risks of the voyage, and made grandiose promises of the riches that awaited in the New World. And even after he had secured funding for his voyages, Columbus continued to use deception to maintain control over his crews. On his first voyage, he kept 2 sets of logs, one for himself, with accurate distances and navigational information, and one for his crew, with deliberately shortened distances to make the journey seem less daunting. In the end, Columbus's legacy is a complicated one. He was undoubtedly a skilled navigator and a brave explorer, but he was also a man who was willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate in order to achieve his goals. And while he may not have proved the Earth was round, he certainly proved that sometimes the greatest inventions are the stories we tell about ourselves. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our whimsical journey through the annals of medieval invention. From the macabre frescoes of the Danse Macabre to the imaginary chastity belts, from the frivolous ear spoons to the grim trade in mummy powder, we've seen that the Middle Ages were a time of great creativity, even if that creativity sometimes manifested in strange and bizarre ways. But perhaps that's the beauty of human ingenuity. It knows no bounds, and it persists even in the face of ignorance, superstition, and outright absurdity. Whether we're putting roosters on trial or sailing across the ocean in search of new lands, we humans have a knack for dreaming up the impossible and making it real. So as you drift off to sleep, dear listener, we invite you to ponder the peculiarities of the past and the enduring power of the human imagination. May your dreams be filled with dancing skeletons and golden ear spoons, with twanging mouth harps and globe-trotting adventurers. And may you wake in the morning with a newfound appreciation for the strange and wonderful world we inhabit. Good night, sweet prince or princess, and may your medieval dreams be as absurd and delightful as the inventions we've explored together. Until next time, this is your faithful historian signing off. As we've seen, the medieval period was a time of great ingenuity and progress, but it also had its fair share of ridiculous inventions and absurd beliefs. From chastity belts to powdered mummies, medieval people came up with some truly head-scratching ideas. Take the mouth harp, for instance. This small musical instrument, also known as the Jew's harp, originated in Asia but became popular in medieval Europe. It consists of a flexible metal or bamboo tongue attached to a frame. The player places the frame against their parted teeth and plucks the tongue with their finger to produce a twanging sound. While the mouth harp may seem like a harmless diversion, playing it well is surprisingly difficult. The player must find just the right angle and tension to create clear notes, and playing anything more complex than a simple tune requires Herculean jaw strength and dexterity. But perhaps the silliest thing about the mouth harp is the faces players make while using it. Imagine a medieval minstrel entertaining a royal court, cheeks hollowed and eyes bugging out as they struggled to pluck out a halfway decent melody. It's no wonder jesters and fools often carried mouth harps. The instrument itself was practically a punchline. The great Leonardo da Vinci even immortalized the mouth harp's ridiculous appearance in a 1481 drawing titled Portrait of a Man Playing a Jew's Harp. The sketch shows a man with puffed out cheeks and a furrowed brow, deeply concentrated on playing the tiny instrument. Even a genius like Leonardo couldn't help but be amused by the mouth harp's absurdity. But the mouth harp wasn't the only musical invention to raise eyebrows in medieval times. Another was the hurdy-gurdy, a stringed instrument operated by a hand crank. Turning the crank caused a rosined wheel to rub against the strings like a violin bow, producing a droning sound. Pitch was controlled with a small keyboard. The hurdy-gurdy was notoriously difficult to keep in tune and required constant maintenance. Its buzzing bagpipe-like tone either delighted or annoyed, depending on one's taste. Some medieval writers complained of hurdy-gurdy players causing a nuisance and disturbing the peace with their racket. But despite its shortcomings, the hurdy-gurdy became a staple of medieval folk music and was associated with beggars and buskers. It even enjoyed a brief vogue among French nobility in the 18th century, with Marie Antoinette taking lessons on the humble peasant instrument as a form of slumming it. The hurdy-gurdy and the mouth harp may have been impractical and silly, but at least they provided some entertainment value. The same can't be said for animal trials, one of the most head-scratching practices of the medieval period. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, animals were put on trial for crimes ranging from theft to murder. Pigs, rats, locusts, and even insects found themselves hauled before a court, complete with defense lawyers, witnesses, and a jury of their peers, or at least other animals. One of the most famous animal trials took place in 1457 in Savigny, France, where a rooster was tried and condemned to death for the unnatural crime of laying an egg. The court feared the egg might hatch a basilisk, a legendary reptile said to kill with a single glance. As ridiculous as it sounds, the rooster's trial was conducted with all the pomp and circumstance of a human proceeding, with the accused fowl even dressed in tiny human clothes for the occasion. Animal trials reflect the strange intersection of medieval law and superstition. In an era when people believed that God's will was expressed through nature, an animal committing an unnatural act was seen as a sign of divine displeasure. Putting the offending creature on trial was a way to restore order and appease an angry God. But animal trials also served a more practical purpose. They were often used to deflect blame and assuage public outrage after a human death or injury. By putting an animal on trial and executing it, authorities could be seen to be doing something while avoiding the trickier task of prosecuting human offenders. For instance, in 1386, a pig was hanged in the French town of Falaise for mauling a human child. The pig's owner, who was accused of negligence, used the trial to clear his own name and pin the blame squarely on the murderous hog. Records show he even testified against his own pig in court. Other animal trials were used to deal with pests like rats or locusts, which could devastate crops. In 1519, the commune of Stelvio, Italy, brought a lawsuit against local moles for damaging fields and vineyards. A defense lawyer was appointed to represent the moles, arguing that they had a God-given right to eat. The court adjourned to consider the moles' case, and the pesky critters used the delay to make their escape. Case dismissed. As ridiculous as these proceedings seem to modern eyes, they highlight the ways medieval people grappled with the capricious forces of nature in a pre-scientific age. When disaster struck, someone, or something, had to take the blame. And if that meant dressing a rooster in people clothes and bringing a bunch of moles to court, so be it. Of course, not every medieval animal trial ended in capital punishment. In some cases, the guilty party was simply excommunicated from the church or banished from the area. In 1519, the Italian commune of Glurns tried a swarm of locusts for damaging crops. The court ordered the insects to leave town within 3 days, adding a caveat that pregnant locusts and locust children could have a bit longer to vacate the premises. That's medieval justice for you. Tough, but fair. While animal trials may seem like a ridiculous relic of a less enlightened age, they didn't completely disappear with the Middle Ages. Believe it or not, Animal trials continued well into the 18th century in some parts of Europe and colonial America. In 1750, a female donkey in Vanvres, France, was accused of bestiality with a human male. The donkey was acquitted after a thorough cross-examination revealed her virtue and good character, but her less fortunate human co-defendant was sentenced to death for his shameful crime. One can only imagine the defense lawyer's impassioned closing argument on behalf of the wrongly accused ass. And as late as 1916, in Irwin, Tennessee, an elephant named Mary was tried and hanged for the murder of her abusive handler. A crowd of over 2,000 people gathered to watch Mary's execution, a grim spectacle that one local newspaper described as a public hanging for a public menace. It seems that even in modern times, the medieval urge to assign blame and mete out punishment to animals dies hard. Speaking of assigning blame, we can't talk about silly medieval ideas without mentioning the flat earth myth. The notion that Christopher Columbus bravely sailed west to prove the earth was round, defying the hopelessly backward medieval belief in a flat earth. It's a nice story, but there's just one problem. It's not true. In fact, the idea of a flat earth was never widely accepted in the Middle Ages, at least not among the educated elite. Since ancient Greek times, scholars had accepted that the earth was a sphere based on astronomical observations and logical deduction. By Columbus's day, the earth's roundness was standard scientific knowledge, taught in all the best universities. So why do we still hear the tired old story of Columbus versus the flat earthers? Blame it on Washington Irving, the 19th century American author famous for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In his 1828 best-selling biography of Columbus, Irving spun a yarn about the brave explorer facing down a panel of ignorant churchmen who insisted the earth was flat. It was pure fiction, but the story stuck, and the flat earth myth has been with us ever since. In reality, Columbus's greatest feat wasn't disproving the flat earth, but rather his skill as a master manipulator and self-promoter. He spent years lobbying the Spanish crown to fund his journey, vastly exaggerating the riches that lay to the west. His persistence paid off when Queen Isabella agreed to finance his voyage, but only after striking a hard bargain. Columbus would be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea and granted a cut of any profits from lands he discovered, a deal that would make him fabulously wealthy if he succeeded and bankrupted if he failed. But Columbus's manipulative streak didn't end there. Once at sea, he lied to his crew about the distance they had traveled, lowering the daily mileage in the ship's log to prevent them from panicking about sailing off the edge of the world, which of course they knew wasn't going to happen because, again, medieval people weren't complete idiots. Columbus also claimed to have seen a light on the horizon just days before sighting land, using this evidence to later argue that he, not a lowly crew member, had been the first to spot the New World. Never mind that what Columbus probably saw was a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and the stress of command. When it came to self-promotion, Columbus was in a league of his own. So while Columbus may not have proved the earth was round, he certainly mastered the art of spinning a good yarn. In a way, he was just carrying on the medieval tradition of blurring the lines between fact and fiction, science and superstition. For all their silly inventions and strange ideas, perhaps medieval people weren't so different from us after all. As we've seen, the medieval period was a time of great creativity, but also great credulity. From macabre medicines to musical instruments that made you look ridiculous, from animal trials to tall tales about the shape of the earth, medieval people had a knack for coming up with ideas that were as absurd as they were ingenious. But perhaps we shouldn't judge them too harshly. After all, every age has its share of silly superstitions and questionable inventions. And who knows how future generations will look back on some of our own beliefs and gadgets. Will they chuckle at our faith in fad diets and miracle cures? Will they roll their eyes at our obsession with smartphones and social media? Only time will tell. In the end, Maybe the real lesson of medieval foolishness is that human creativity knows no bounds, for better or for worse. Whether we're putting pigs on trial, or sending probes to Mars, building chastity belts, or inventing life-saving vaccines, we humans can't seem to help but to dream up new ways to make sense of our world, even if some of those ways turn out to be completely nonsensical. So the next time you come across a silly idea or a ridiculous invention, whether from medieval times or the modern world, take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of the human imagination. And then, if you're feeling generous, spare a thought for the poor medieval fools who came up with some of history's worst ideas. They may have been misguided, but at least they were never boring. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the silliest inventions and ideas of the Middle Ages. I hope you've enjoyed this whimsical look at a time that was as ridiculous as it was remarkable. As you drift off to sleep, ponder the eternal foibles and follies of human ingenuity. And if you find yourself dreaming of chastity belts and drumming pigs, of mouth harps and powdered mummies, just remember, it could be worse. At least you're not a medieval rooster being tried for laying an egg. Sweet dreams, powdered mummy, a macabre medicine that just might cure what ails you, if you can stomach it. Let's rewind to medieval times, an age of questionable cures and even more questionable ingredients. For wealthy Europeans of the era, one of the most prized medicines was a substance known as mummia, a fine powder made from ground-up mummy parts. Yes, you heard that right. Mummies weren't just the stuff of monster stories, but a highly sought-after remedy said to heal everything from headaches to bubonic plague. The idea of ingesting human remains for health benefits might seem outrageous today, but for medieval doctors, it was cutting-edge science. The use of mummia can be traced back to ancient Arabic medicine, where physicians prized the bitumen and resins used in Egyptian mummification for their supposed healing properties. During the Crusades, European soldiers and merchants encountered these practices and brought the concept back home with them, sparking a continental craze for the embalmed elixir. Soon, European apothecaries, alchemists, and physicians were clamoring to get their hands on genuine Egyptian mummies. A bustling trade emerged to feed the frenzy, with mummy hunters scouring the Nile Valley to unearth and export the ancient dead. Tombs were raided, corpses were smuggled, and a literal mummy market arose to supply the growing demand. It was, in effect, a precursor to the modern pharmaceutical industry, only instead of lab-synthesized drugs, the key ingredient was pilfered body parts. One of the most prominent proponents of mummia was Guy de la Fontaine, a royal physician to the French king Charles VI. In 1408, Fontaine travelled to Alexandria, where he witnessed firsthand the preparation and sale of powdered mummy. He described the process in gruesome detail, noting how the corpses were ripped apart and boiled in oil to extract the precious medicinal substances. Fontaine brought this knowledge back to France, where he prescribed mummia to his noble patients and further promoted its use throughout Europe. But the efficacy of mummia is highly suspect, to say the least. Modern analysis of purported mummia powders has revealed that many didn't contain any human remains at all, but were made from various animal bones, wood resins, and other materials. In some cases, the powder wasn't even from Egypt. Fakes were produced using corpses from European cemeteries or even executed criminals. The whole industry was something of a scam, playing on people's desperation for cures and the allure of the exotic. Ingesting mummia also came with serious risks beyond mere quackery. Many mummies contained high levels of toxic substances like mercury, lead, and arsenic, which could cause illness or even death when consumed. One can only imagine the side effects of regularly dosing oneself with embalming chemicals and ancient cadaver dust. It's safe to say that mummia probably created more health problems than it ever solved. The mummia craze reached its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, when the practice was endorsed by famed physicians like Paracelsus and Sir Francis Bacon. Mummies became a hot commodity, with wealthy collectors vying to acquire the most pristine and potent specimens. But by the 1700s, the fad had run its course, and mumia gradually fell out of favour as more scientific approaches to medicine emerged. Today, the use of mumia is rightly dismissed as a bizarre and misguided practice, a relic of a time when medical knowledge was still heavily infused with superstition and pseudoscience. But it's also a reminder of the deep human desire to find cures and conquer death, even if the methods are macabre. The story of mumia is a strange and morbid one, but it's also a testament to the enduring power of belief and the lengths people will go to in search of miracle remedies. So the next time you reach for a bottle of aspirin, take a moment to be grateful that your medicine cabinet isn't stocked with the pulverized remains of long-dead Egyptians. And if you're ever tempted to try a traditional cure touted as an ancient panacea, remember the cautionary tale of mumia. Sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease. But mumia wasn't the only dubious device dreamt up in medieval times. Another invention that surely set some medieval jaws wagging was the mouth harp, also known as the Jew's harp. This small, unassuming instrument produces an oddly twangy sound, but playing it requires contorting your face into some seriously silly expressions. The exact origins of the mouth harp are lost to history, but it seems to have emerged independently in various pockets of Asia and Europe sometime in the Middle Ages. It's a deceptively simple instrument, consisting of a flexible steel or bamboo tongue attached to a frame. The player holds the frame in front of their parted teeth and plucks the tongue, using their mouth as a resonator to amplify and alter the sound. But simple doesn't mean easy to play. While it's fairly easy to get basic tones out of a mouth harp, playing it with any degree of skill is another matter entirely. The mouth harp demands an odd combination of coordination, breath control, and facial dexterity. Players must master complex techniques like bending notes, trilling, and even circular breathing to sustain longer passages. And then there are the facial contortions. To play the mouth harp well, you really have to get your whole face involved. Lips pursed, cheeks sucked in, eyebrows raised. It's quite the sight to behold. In fact, one of the earliest known depictions of a mouth harp player comes from none other than Leonardo da Vinci. In a 1481 sketch, da Vinci drew a man playing a mouth harp, his face comically scrunched up in concentration. It just goes to show that even the greatest minds of the Renaissance could be amused by the instrument's silly appearance. Despite its humorous reputation, the mouth harp did gain some popularity in medieval Europe. It was particularly favoured by travelling minstrels and troubadours, who appreciated its portability and versatility. The mouth harp could provide a quick and lively accompaniment to songs and dances, and it was also used for comedic effect in performances. In some parts of Europe, the mouth harp even developed a rather bawdy reputation. Its twangy, buzzing tone was said to resemble certain bodily functions, and it was often used in ribald songs and jokes. There's even a medieval French poem that compares the sound of a mouth harp to the noise of a fly trapped in a lady's posterior. Such was the level of humour in the Middle Ages. But the mouth harp was more than just a musical novelty. In some cultures, it was imbued with spiritual and mystical significance. In Siberia, for example, shamans used mouth harps in healing rituals, believing the instrument's vibrations could realign the body's energy and cure ailments. Tuvan throat singers also incorporated mouth harps into their performances, using the instrument to create otherworldly overtones and harmonics. Today, the mouth harp is experiencing something of a renaissance, particularly in the world of experimental and alternative music. Artists like Björk, Tom Waits, and The Who have all featured the instrument in their recordings, and there's a growing community of mouth harp enthusiasts around the globe. But for all its newfound popularity, the mouth harp remains a rather odd and acquired taste. Its distinctive sound and challenging playing technique put it firmly in the category of love it or hate it. And there's still no getting around the fact that playing it makes you look a bit goofy. But perhaps that's part of the mouth harp's enduring charm. It's a reminder not to take ourselves too seriously, even in the pursuit of art. So if you ever find yourself at a medieval-themed party or an avant-garde music festival, keep an ear out for the telltale twang of the mouth harp. And if you're feeling brave, maybe give it a try yourself. Just be prepared for some sore cheeks and funny looks. The medieval inventors of the mouth harp certainly didn't mind looking a little silly in the name of entertainment. But looking foolish was the least of people's worries in the Middle Ages, especially when the law got involved. In fact, medieval legal systems had a rather bizarre way of dealing with certain crimes, putting animals on trial. Yes, you read that right. Throughout medieval Europe, there are recorded instances of pigs, rats, locusts, and even roosters being hauled into court to face charges. To our modern sensibilities, the idea of trying an animal for a crime seems utterly absurd. After all, animals can't understand human laws or moral codes, let alone mount a legal defense. But in the Middle Ages, the lines between human and animal were often blurred, and there was a widespread belief that all of God's creatures were subject to divine law. The most common animals put on trial were pigs, usually for the crime of killing or injuring a human, often a child. Pigs were a ubiquitous presence in medieval towns and villages, often roaming freely and mingling with the human population. Inevitably, accidents and altercations occurred, and when a pig was implicated in a serious incident, it was not uncommon for the animal to be arrested and brought to court. These porcine proceedings were conducted with all the pomp and circumstance of a human trial. The accused pig would be dressed in human clothes, placed in a special cage or pen, and even assigned a lawyer to argue its case. Witnesses would be called, evidence would be presented, and the pig's fate would be decided by a jury of its human peers. If found guilty, the punishment for a pig was usually execution, often by hanging, but sometimes by more gruesome methods like being buried alive or burned at the stake. In some cases, the pig's owner might also face penalties, either for negligence in allowing the animal to run amok, or for the cost of housing and feeding the pig during its trial. But pigs weren't the only defendants in these bizarre animal courts. In 1457, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was put on trial for the heinous crime of laying an egg. The egg in question was deemed unnatural and possibly even demonic, as it was widely believed that only hens could lay eggs. The rooster, along with its mysterious egg, were burned at the stake as a warning against such ungodly aberrations. Other frequent animal defendants included rats and locusts, which were often charged with destroying crops or infesting granaries. These vermin trials could take on an almost farcical air, with lawyers arguing passionately on behalf of their tiny clients and judges issuing solemn rulings on the fate of the accused creatures. In one famous case from the early 16th century, the town of Autun, France was besieged by a plague of rats. The townspeople took the matter to court, appointing a lawyer to defend the rats and another to prosecute them. The trial dragged on for months, with the defense lawyer arguing that the rats had not been properly summoned to court and that their rights were being violated. In the end, the rats were acquitted, but only because the townsfolk had failed to provide them with a suitable alternative place to live. As amusing as these animal trials may seem to us today, they reflect a very different way of thinking about the natural world and the role of law in society. For medieval people, the idea that animals could be held accountable for their actions was not so far-fetched. After all, if God had created all living things, then surely they were all subject to his judgment. There was also a practical element to these trials. By assigning blame to an animal, medieval communities could provide a sense of justice and closure in the face of inexplicable tragedies like a child's death. The public spectacle of an animal trial also served as a warning and a deterrent, reminding people to keep a close eye on their livestock and pets. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval animal trials is what they reveal about the blurry boundaries between human and animal in the medieval imagination. By putting animals on trial, medieval people were in a sense acknowledging their capacity for agency, will, and even moral responsibility. It was a strange and contradictory view, to be sure. Animals could be tried and punished like humans, but they were still considered fundamentally inferior and subject to human dominion. In the end, the practice of animal trials gradually faded away as legal systems became more codified and scientific understanding of animal behavior advanced. But the legacy of these bizarre proceedings lives on in our collective memory, a reminder of a time when the line between man and beast was not so clear-cut. So the next time your cat knocks over a vase or your dog chews up a shoe, be thankful that we've moved beyond the era of animal trials. In the Middle Ages, your mischievous pet might have found itself in the dock, facing a jury of stern-faced humans. It's a silly thought, but also a sobering reminder of how far our understanding of the animal world has come, and how much further we still have to go. Of course, sometimes it's not just our understanding of animals that's a bit misguided. It's our understanding of the world itself. Take, for example, the persistent myth that medieval people believed the earth was flat. It's a common misconception, often trotted out to demonstrate the supposed ignorance and backwardness of the Middle Ages. But the reality is quite different. The idea that Christopher Columbus had to convince a skeptical world that the earth was round is a popular bit of historical fiction, but it's just that, fiction. In fact, by Columbus's time, the notion of a spherical earth had been widely accepted by scholars and navigators for centuries. The ancient Greeks were the first to propose the idea of a round earth, based on observations of lunar eclipses and the curved shadow of the earth on the moon. By the time of Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, the concept of a spherical earth was well established in Greek science and philosophy. This knowledge was passed down through the centuries, preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars during the Middle Ages. Thinkers like al-Biruni and Avicenna wrote extensively about the Earth's shape and size, using mathematical calculations and astronomical observations to refine their understanding. So if medieval scholars knew the Earth was round, why do we still cling to the idea of a flat Earth Columbus? The myth seems to have originated in the 19th century, when writers like Washington Irving and Antoine Jean Letron popularized the story of Columbus's supposed battle against ignorance and superstition. In reality, Columbus's great innovation was not his belief in a round Earth, but his wildly inaccurate estimates of the Earth's size. Columbus convinced himself, and more importantly the Spanish crown, that the distance from Europe to Asia was much shorter than it actually was. He argued that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach the riches of the East much faster than the traditional overland route. In this sense, Columbus was less a visionary scientist than a master manipulator, able to sell a dubious geographical theory to secure funding for his ambitious voyages. And when he finally did reach land in the Caribbean, Columbus stubbornly clung to the belief that he had indeed reached Asia, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Columbus's willingness to bend the truth didn't stop there. On his first voyage, he kept 2 sets of logs, one accurate record for himself and one with fudged numbers to show his crew. By consistently underreporting the distance they had traveled each day, Columbus could keep his men from realizing just how far from home they really were. It's a bit ironic, then, that Columbus has come to be associated with the triumph of scientific truth over medieval superstition. In reality, he was a man who relied more on bluster and deception than on facts and reason. He may have been a skilled navigator and a brave explorer, but he was hardly a paragon of scientific virtue. The myth of the flat Earth Columbus is a reminder of how our understanding of history can be shaped by the agendas and assumptions of those who write it. It's a story that says more about the prejudices of the 19th century than it does about the realities of the 15th. But it's also a story that underscores the enduring power of a good narrative. The idea of a lone visionary fighting against the tide of ignorance is a compelling one, even if it doesn't quite match up with the facts. And in the end, perhaps that's the real lesson of the flat Earth myth, that sometimes a well-told story can be more powerful than the truth. As we've seen throughout our journey into the weird and wonderful world of medieval inventions, the Middle Ages were a time of great creativity and ingenuity, even if some of those creations were a bit misguided. From macabre medicines to animal trials, medieval people were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was possible, even if they sometimes stumbled into the absurd. But that's the thing about human innovation. It's not always a straight line from A to B. Sometimes we have to wander down a few dead ends before we find the path forward. And sometimes those dead ends can be pretty entertaining in their own right. After all, who wouldn't want to hear the story of a pig on trial or a rooster burned at the stake for laying an egg? These tales may not have much practical value, but they do have the power to capture our imaginations and remind us of the strangeness and wonder of the past. And in a way, that's what history is all about. Not just a dry recitation of dates and facts, but a living, breathing tapestry of human experience in all its glorious messiness. From the lofty heights of philosophical debate to the lowly depths of the medieval joke book, the past is full of stories that have the power to amuse, to horrify, and to inspire. So as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those distant days of yore, when mummies were medicine and animals had their day in court. Let the sounds of the mouth harp and the sea. As we've seen, medieval Europe was a time of great contradiction, an era of remarkable advances in art, architecture, and science, but also a breeding ground for some of history's most absurd inventions. From macabre medicines to impractical devices, the Middle Ages were rife with ridiculous creations that now seem more at home in a Monty Python sketch than a history book. But perhaps that's what makes this period so endlessly fascinating, the sheer audacity and eccentricity of the medieval mind. Take, for instance, the peculiar practice of animal trials. To the modern observer, the idea of putting a pig or a rooster on trial for crimes seems utterly ludicrous. But for medieval Europeans, these proceedings were deadly serious business. In a world where the lines between human and animal were often blurred, it was not uncommon for creatures to be held to the same legal standards as their two-legged counterparts. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon occurred in the Swiss town of Basel in 1457. The defendant in question was a rooster, accused of the heinous crime of laying an egg. Now, as any modern biologist could tell you, roosters do not lay eggs. But try telling that to the medieval court of Basel. The rooster's trial was a spectacle to behold. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and lawyers argued passionately for and against the accused. In the end, the court reached a verdict. The rooster was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning at the stake. The unfortunate bird was led to the town square, tied to a post, and set ablaze before a cheering crowd. It's easy to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but animal trials like these offer a fascinating glimpse into the medieval psyche. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, the notion of holding animals accountable for their crimes provided a sense of order and control. If a pig could be put on trial for trampling a child, then perhaps the chaos of the universe could be tamed, even if only for a moment. But animal trials weren't the only way in which medieval Europeans sought to impose order on their world. The medieval flat earth myth is another prime example. For centuries, the notion that Christopher Columbus bravely sailed west to prove the earth was round has been a staple of elementary school history classes. But as any medievalist worth their salt will tell you, this story is pure fiction. In fact, the idea that medieval people believed the earth was flat is itself a modern invention. As early as the 6th century BCE, Greek philosophers like Pythagoras and Aristotle had provided convincing evidence that the earth was a sphere. By the Middle Ages, this knowledge was widespread among educated Europeans, including the scholars and navigators who advised Columbus. So why has the flat earth myth persisted for so long? The answer may lie in Columbus's own masterful manipulation of the truth. You see, Columbus wasn't just a navigator, he was also a skilled salesman. In order to secure funding for his voyages, he had to convince the Spanish crown that his plan was not only feasible, but profitable. And what better way to do that than to portray himself as a daring visionary, bravely setting out to prove the naysayers wrong? Of course, Columbus's salesmanship didn't end there. Once he finally set sail, he continued to manipulate the truth to suit his own ends. When his crew grew restless and threatened to mutiny, Columbus lied to them about the distance they had traveled, making it seem as though they were closer to their destination than they really were. In this way, he managed to keep his men in line and complete his historic voyage. But while Columbus may have been a master manipulator, he was hardly alone in this regard. Throughout the Middle Ages, people at all levels of society used deception and misdirection to get what they wanted. From the lowliest peasant to the highest king, the ability to bend the truth was a valuable skill in a world where power was often wielded through cunning rather than brute force. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the worst inventions of the Middle Ages. From the silly to the macabre, these bizarre creations offer a window into a world that was at once deeply familiar and utterly alien. A world where roosters could be put on trial and mummies could be ground up into medicine. A world where ingenuity and absurdity often went hand in hand. But perhaps that's the enduring legacy of the Middle Ages, the reminder that human creativity knows no bounds, even in the darkest and strangest of times. That no matter how bleak or bizarre the world may seem, there is always room for wonder, for laughter, and for the unexpected. So as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those medieval days of yore. Imagine yourself wandering the winding streets of a bustling market town, dodging pigs and roosters and merchants hawking their wares. Picture yourself marveling at the elaborate frescoes of the Danse Macabre, or chuckling at the sight of a nobleman playing a mouth harp. And as you do, remember that the Middle Ages were more than just a time of darkness and superstition. They were also a time of great creativity and ingenuity, even if that ingenuity sometimes took the form of a chastity belt or a powdered mummy. So let yourself be lulled to sleep by the gentle rhythms of medieval life, secure in the knowledge that no matter how strange or scary the world may seem, there is always something to wonder at, something to learn, and something to smile about. Good night, dear listener, and sweet medieval dreams. And so, we've seen how the chastity belt was not a real medieval invention at all, but rather a satirical joke that emerged in the Renaissance and took on a life of its own. The myth of its actual use in the Middle Ages persisted for centuries, perhaps because it fits so neatly into our modern stereotypes about the backwards and barbaric nature of medieval times. But the truth is often stranger and sillier than fiction. Speaking of silly, let us turn now to one of the more frivolous medieval innovations, the humble ear spoon. Yes, you heard that right. A spoon dedicated solely to the scooping of one's earwax. In an age not exactly known for its hygiene, where bathing was a once-a-year affair if you were lucky, the notion of a special utensil just for cleaning your ears seems rather ridiculous. But for the medieval elite, no item of grooming was too specific or too extravagant. Imagine, if you will, a well-to-do lord or lady decked out in their finest velvets and furs, reaching into their purse to retrieve a delicate little spoon of silver or ivory, intricately carved just for the purpose of extracting that pesky earwax. It was the ultimate personal accessory. In fact, the most famous ear spoon of all belonged to none other than King Henry VIII himself. This royal ear-picking device was even inventoried among Henry's most prized possessions at his death. One can only imagine the court gossip that must have surrounded such an intimate item. Perhaps a scandalous rumour spread that Anne Boleyn had used the king's own ear spoon, a Tudor-era equivalent of sharing a toothbrush. The mind boggles at the thought of what other hygienic horrors lurked beneath those voluminous velvet sleeves. But lest we judge our medieval ancestors too harshly for their selective grooming habits, we must remember that even today, specialized items abound for every conceivable need, from avocado slicers to banana cases. The ear spoon, frivolous as it may seem, was merely the Q-tip of its day. And speaking of frivolous, we come now to an invention that was not so much an object as an idea, albeit a rather loopy one. The notion of putting animals on trial for crimes. Yes, you read that correctly. In the Middle Ages, all manner of creatures, from pigs to locusts to rats, found themselves hauled before the court to answer for their supposed misdeeds. One of the earliest recorded animal trials dates back to 1266 in France, when a pig was executed for the murder of a child. The poor pig was even dressed up in human clothes for the occasion, as if to add an extra layer of absurdity to the proceedings. But this was far from an isolated incident. Across medieval Europe, animals were routinely put on trial for everything from theft to vandalism to even witchcraft. Take, for example, the bizarre case of a rooster in Basel, Switzerland in 1474. This hapless chicken was accused of the heinous crime of laying an egg, which was seen as an unnatural and potentially demonic act. The rooster's egg was put on trial right alongside the bird, with a court-appointed lawyer arguing in its defense. In the end, both rooster and egg were found guilty and burned at the stake together as a warning to other would-be offenders. It's easy to laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of these animal trials, but they reflect a deeper medieval belief in the interconnectedness of the natural and spiritual worlds. Animals were seen as creatures capable of moral choices and subject to divine law, just like humans. In a way, putting them on trial was a backhanded acknowledgement of their agency and importance. Of course, our modern sensibilities rightly balk at the idea of executing a pig in human clothing or burning a rooster for the crime of laying an egg. These trials may have been conducted with all the pomp and circumstance of a human court case, but they were ultimately a reflection of the rather superstitious and unscientific medieval worldview. And speaking of unscientific worldviews, we would be remiss not to mention one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages, the notion that people back then believed the earth was flat. This idea has become so ingrained in popular culture that it's often taken as a given, a symbol of the backwardness and ignorance of our ancestors. But here's the thing, it's simply not true. Contrary to popular belief, the idea of a flat earth was not some universal medieval dogma. In fact, educated people in the Middle Ages were well aware that the earth was a sphere. This knowledge dated all the way back to ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Ptolemy, and it was never really lost in the West. So where did this myth of medieval flat earthers come from? Ironically, it seems to have originated in the 19th century, when some writers and historians were eager to paint a stark contrast between the dark ages of medieval times and the enlightened modern era. The flat earth myth was a way of emphasizing how far humanity had supposedly come. But in reality, the notion of a flat earth was never a mainstream belief in the Middle Ages. Even that most famous of medieval flat earthers, Christopher Columbus, knew full well that the earth was round. His innovation was not proving the earth's sphericity, but rather his audacious plan to reach the east by sailing west, a scheme he sold to the Spanish crown with all the skill of a master manipulator. Indeed, Columbus's real invention may have been his ability to spin a good yarn. He swindled Queen Isabella with wild tales of the riches that lay in the east, promising her a share of the profits from his voyage. And when his crew grew restless on the long journey across the Atlantic, Columbus even lied to them about the distance they had traveled, altering his navigational logs to make it seem like they were closer to their goal than they really were. In the end, Columbus may have been a brilliant navigator and a brave explorer, but his true genius lay in his ability to deceive and persuade. He may not have discovered a new world, but he certainly invented a new way of selling one. And so, as we come to the end of our whirlwind tour through some of the worst and wackiest inventions of the Middle Ages, we are left with a sense of the absurdity and ingenuity of the human spirit. From the chastity belt that never was, to the ear spoon that cleaned the royal wax, to the animal trials that put pigs in the dock, to the flat earth myth that was no myth at all, medieval times were a mixed bag of the brilliant and the ridiculous. But perhaps that is the enduring charm of this era, the way it reflects both the heights and the depths of human creativity. In a time of great progress and great superstition, of soaring cathedrals and bizarre beliefs, medieval inventors were not afraid to let their imaginations run wild, even if the results were sometimes more silly than sensible. And in a way, that spirit of invention, that willingness to take a leap of faith and try something new, no matter how absurd, is something we could all learn from today. In a world that often feels like it's spinning out of control, maybe we need a little more of that medieval madness, that ability to look at the world sideways and come up with a solution that's so crazy it just might work. So the next time you find yourself facing a problem that seems insurmountable, ask yourself, what would a medieval inventor do? Would they reach for the chastity belt or the ear spoon? Would they put a pig on trial or sail off the edge of the world? Or would they, like Columbus, spin a tall tale and make it come true through sheer force of will? The answer, of course, is up to you. But as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world where anything is possible, where even the silliest idea can change the course of history. Let us embrace the spirit of the medieval inventor, and let our imaginations soar to new heights, even if we occasionally fall flat on our faces. Sweet dreams, dear listener. And may your medieval inventions be more brilliant than bizarre. Good night, and pleasant journeys through the mists of time. Certainly, let's continue the script for the worst inventions from medieval times. Boring history for sleep. The year was 1457 in the charming village of Lausanne, Switzerland. Imagine a picturesque medieval town nestled at the foot of the Alps, with cobblestone streets winding between half-timbered houses. But on this particular day, the peaceful village was abuzz with unusual activity. A crowd had gathered around the town square, murmuring with anticipation. But this was no ordinary public spectacle. Oh no, for today, a rooster was on trial. Yes, you heard that right. A rooster, a simple barnyard bird, was the defendant in a court of law, the charge, laying an egg. Now, as any medieval peasant could tell you, roosters don't typically lay eggs. That's a hen's job. So, when a local rooster was found next to a suspiciously egg-shaped object, the townspeople were aghast. Clearly, this was no ordinary egg, but a sure sign of dark magic and devilry. The rooster was swiftly arrested and hauled before the court. The prosecution presented the egg as evidence, arguing that it was a devil's egg laid by the rooster under the influence of witchcraft. The defense, a presumably very confused lawyer, tried to argue that the rooster was innocent and that the egg was simply a bizarre but natural occurrence. But the court would have none of it. In a solemn proceeding, the rooster was convicted of sorcery and sentenced to death. The method of execution: burning at the stake, the same fate that awaited convicted witches. And so, the unfortunate rooster met a fiery end, condemned by the absurd logic of the medieval justice system. As ridiculous as it may seem to modern sensibilities, animal trials like this one were not uncommon in medieval Europe. Records show legal proceedings against all manner of creatures, from rats to locusts to weevils. In 1474, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, was similarly tried and executed for laying an egg. It seems that egg-laying roosters were a particular concern. But why go through the trouble of a full legal proceeding? Why not simply dispatch the offending animal and be done with it? Well, in the medieval world view, animals were seen as subject to the law, just like humans. If an animal committed what was seen as a crime, it was given its day in court. There was also a religious element to these trials. Animals exhibiting strange behaviors, like our egg-laying rooster, were often seen as being possessed by demons. A trial and execution was a way to rid the community of this evil influence. Never mind that the real cause was likely a simple biological quirk, a hen that looked like a rooster, for example. In some cases, the animals were appointed defense lawyers and witnesses were called to testify. The proceedings could be quite elaborate, with the accused creature brought before the court in a cage or restraints. In one famous case from 1522, a group of rats was put on trial for infesting a German town. The rat's lawyer argued that his clients had not been properly notified of the proceedings, and the trial was postponed to give them time to prepare a defense. Of course, the outcomes of these trials were usually a foregone conclusion. Just as our poor Swiss rooster was never going to escape the flames, the rats of Germany were unlikely to be acquitted. The real purpose of these proceedings seems to have been to restore a sense of order and justice in a world that could often feel chaotic and unpredictable. By putting animals on trial, medieval people were asserting their dominance over the natural world. They were also grappling with questions of free will, guilt, and punishment, weighty matters that have preoccupied legal minds for centuries. In a way, these animal trials were a reflection of the deeply held belief that everything, from the lowliest insect to the loftiest human, was subject to divine and earthly laws. So the next time you crack an egg for your breakfast, spare a thought for our unfortunate medieval rooster. Though his trial and execution may seem laughable today, it reflects a worldview that was deeply serious to those who held it. And while we may have moved on from putting animals in the dock, the questions of justice and culpability that animated these proceedings are still very much with us today. As we ponder these weighty matters, let us drift gently into the realm of slumber. Like the misunderstood rooster of Lausanne, may we find peace in our dreams, free from the judgment of the waking world. May our sleep be as sweet as a freshly laid egg, and may we wake to a world a little kinder and a little wiser than the one we left behind. Good night, dear listener, and pleasant medieval dreams. Henry VIII, famous for marrying 6 women, beheading 2, and siring the future Queen Elizabeth I. But did you know that one of the eccentric English monarch's most prized possessions was a spoon? That's right, a bejeweled ear spoon he used to scoop the wax from his royal eardrums. Henry was known to always keep his trusty ear spoon close at hand, hanging from a belt or necklace. Lest you think Henry was uniquely fastidious about his ears, ear spoons were actually a common accessory for medieval nobility. These slender implements, made from precious metals and stones, were the medieval equivalent of today's cotton swabs. Since the Middle Ages lacked effective hygiene practices by modern standards, it may seem odd that the upper classes were so concerned with earwax. Yet a clean ear canal was apparently an emblem of status and refinement. Noble knights and ladies proudly displayed their delicate ear spoons at court like jewellery. Detailed records of Henry VIII's belongings at his death reveal dozens of these auricular cleaners, some crafted from gold with pearl or ruby decorations. King Henry bequeathed several ear spoons to his daughters Queen Mary I and Queen Elizabeth I in his will. While swords and lances were a knight's weapons on the battlefield, an ear spoon was his secret weapon in the medieval dating arena. Speaking of dubious medieval devices, let's turn now to one of the most infamous inventions of the era, or perhaps we should say non-inventions. I'm referring to the chastity belt, that metallic contraption of locks and hinges supposedly designed to protect the virtue of maidens and the fidelity of wives. You've likely seen gag gift or prank versions of these mythical underwear. But did medieval men really lock up their ladies' nether regions with wrought iron underwear? Almost certainly not, according to modern historians. While a handful of real metal chastity belts from medieval Europe do exist in museums today, most experts believe these were satirical novelties rather than actual devices used to ensure female chastity. References to chastity belts as a wearable anti-seduction device first appeared in 15th century European poetry as a symbol of fidelity, not a real physical apparatus. One of the earliest known depictions of a chastity belt comes from a 1405 drawing in a work of political allegory. The satirical poem Bellifortis features a comical sketch of a woman wearing a metal bikini bottom and a man with a key. The implication was that only her husband possessed the key to her ahim, heart. It seems this fanciful invention originated as a bawdy Renaissance joke that men told about locking down their wives. The myth of the chastity belt's actual use arose centuries later in the 1800s. Several British and German museums began displaying ornate metal chastity belts, which they claimed were worn by lustful ladies while their husbands were off at the Crusades. These were later proven to be fakes or forgeries crafted in the 1800s, some 500 years after the Crusades and Middle Ages had ended. Yet the hoax of the chastity belt endured. Even today, many wrongly believe that medieval husbands routinely lock their wives into genital jail cells before galloping off to war. The imagined chastity belt became a misogynistic symbol of an oppressed medieval womanhood, a handy myth to make modern relationships seem enlightened by comparison. But let's consider the impracticalities of such a device, even had it existed. A metal chastity belt would have been punitively uncomfortable, causing painful chafing and pinching. How would a belted woman use the bathroom? And after a few months without bathing, the unhygienic undercarriage would become a cesspool of sweat, bacteria, and infection. Not an effective way to preserve her sexual purity, I'd wager. Contrary to this kinky myth, most medieval folk had a much more direct way of dealing with infidelity: fines, flogging, or capital punishment. Chastity belts ultimately tell us far more about Victorian fetishes and modern misconceptions of medieval times than they do about the actual sexual practices of the Middle Ages. A perhaps more disturbing invention did exist in medieval torture chambers, the so-called pair of anguish, a metal device used to mutilate the genitals and rectums of victims. But that's a cringeworthy tale for another sleepy time. Let's turn now to another ghastly medieval invention, one that surely ranks as both the grossest and most bizarre of the era's faux medicaments. Imagine a plague is ravaging your kingdom and killing scores of your subjects. What do? If you were Guy de la Fontaine, royal physician to the King of France, the answer was simple: feed them powdered mummy. Yes, that's right. The ground-up remains of long-dead Egyptian cadavers. Surely one of the worst medieval innovations was the prized apothecary ingredient known as mumia, a brown powder or sticky tar made from mummified human flesh. In medieval Europe, mumia was touted as a potent elixir said to cure everything from epilepsy to upset stomachs, headaches, to the Black Death itself. This morbid miracle cure originated with Arabic doctors who first described using bitumen, the tarry petroleum preservative found in some mummy tombs, as early as the 10th century. They called it mumia, from the Persian word for bitumen. During the Crusades in the 12th and 13th centuries, Europeans encountered this exotic drug in the Middle East and brought it back with them. The medicinal use of mumia soon spread across Europe. However, These medieval mummy merchants quickly exhausted their limited supply of genuine mummified bitumen from Egypt and the Levant, so they started making counterfeit mumia, which contained little to no actual mummy. Most of this ersatz elixir was nothing more than pitch and ashes, mixed with rancid pieces of rotted mummy meat and bones, all ground into a pungent powder. By the 1400s, Europeans began to ignore the Arabic origins of the word mumia and assumed it must come from the word mummy, as in embalmed Egyptian corpses. The new marketing tactic became corpse medicine. Apothecaries, doctors, and quacks promoted the idea that the power of mumia came from the ancient mummification process itself. Tombs across Egypt were plundered for mummies that were smuggled to Europe, and an entire industry arose to meet the demand for this macabre drug. One infamous account comes from Guy de la Fontaine, royal doctor to King Charles VI of France in the 1390s. De la Fontaine wrote about raiding the tomb of an ancient Egyptian sultan and stealing the mummy's head, which he then ground into mumia powder and fed to his epileptic patients. He claimed it cured them almost instantly. Such ghoulish tales fueled a booming trade in stolen mummies, creating perhaps the world's first illicit drug trade, the spectre of medieval Breaking Bad. Huge public auctions of contraband mummies took place in ports across Europe, from Venice to London to Bremen. Professional mummy dealers cut up corpses and sold individual body parts to physicians, apothecaries, and self-styled alchemists. Perhaps most disturbingly, when real Egyptian mummies became too difficult to obtain, some unscrupulous merchants went so far as to manufacture their own mummies from the bodies of dead peasants, beggars, and slaves. Hundreds of lower-class Europeans had their flesh boiled off their bones in counterfeit mummification schemes. Their desiccated bodies were then ground up and sold as genuine mumia. Powdered mummy became one of the most valuable commodities in medieval and Renaissance Europe, its price rivaling opium, saffron, and gold. Famous proponents included King Francis I of France and England's King Charles II. The corpse medicine craze endured for over 500 years. As late as the 18th century, mumia was still listed as an essential ingredient in the respected medical texts of the era. So next time you have a headache, be grateful that you have aspirin and ibuprofen rather than the skull dust of a long-dead pharaoh. As we explored in our previous segments, medieval Europe was a time of fascinating contrasts, an era of genuine brilliance and innovation, but also one prone to flights of folly. A world where great thinkers and inventors coexisted alongside charlatans and quack doctors peddling macabre medicines, where probing minds sought to understand the mysteries of the universe, while others indulged in farcical animal trials and flaunted frivolous fashions. It's this very contradiction, the high and the low, the sublime and the ridiculous, that makes the Middle Ages such an intriguing period to study. And yet, for all its seeming strangeness to our modern sensibilities, we can still recognize glimmers of ourselves in our medieval forebears. Their curiosity, ingenuity, fears and foibles, the very human impulse to create, even if the end result was a bit misguided at times. There's something oddly endearing about a nobleman carrying around a bejeweled ear spoon, or an unknown artisan forging the first satirical chastity belt, tongue firmly in cheek. One can almost picture them centuries ago, these colourful characters, the pious and the pranksters alike. Indeed, that's what makes the study of history so compelling. This sense of connection with our distant ancestors, the ability to imagine ourselves in their shoes, walking the same earth, grappling with timeless questions and concerns, to ponder what they might think of our own modern world with its wonders and worries. Would they be amazed by our advances or amused by our own occasional absurdities? But I digress. The hour grows late, and the mists of time grow thick. As we wind our way through these drowsy medieval byways, I sense it's time we draw our journey to a close. So let us linger a moment longer, here in this realm of valiant knights and villainous plagues, of earnest alchemists and eccentric artists. And as we do, perhaps we'll find that the Middle Ages have one final lesson to teach us: the importance of appreciating the grand tapestry of human experience in all its richness and complexity. The light and the darkness, the lofty aspirations and the endearingly human limitations. And so, my fellow traveller, I bid you rest. Let the images of prancing skeletons and pestilent pigs, of rooster trials and royal ear spoons, dance merrily through your dreams. May you wake in the morning with a renewed sense of wonder at the marvellous, confounding pageant of history. And if perchance you find yourself reaching for a powdered mummy elixir, well, perhaps think twice and brew yourself a soothing cup of chamomile tea instead. Good night, dear listener. Good night, and sweet medieval dreams to you from all of us here at Boring History for Sleep. Until next time, when we meet again on some other forgotten byway of the human story. When once more we'll dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and let the sands of time softly lull us to slumber. Meanwhile, another afflicted town had gotten creative in dealing with their supposed locust perpetrators. In 1545, the rural burgh of Saint-Julien, France, was suffering from a devastating swarm of locusts stripping bare their crops and fields. At their wits' end, the villagers convened and appointed a local lawyer to serve as the defense advocate for the locusts. This lawyer, a man by the name of Barthélemy de Chasseneuze, found himself in the unenviable position of having to defend a ravenous swarm of insects. In his most famous argument, Chasseneuze declared that the locusts had as much a God-given right to eat as the villagers did. It was the first, and perhaps only, time the sharing is caring defense was invoked in a court of law. But Chasseneuze didn't stop there. He also argued that the locusts could not be tried en masse, but instead each individual locust had to be tried separately. Can you imagine the paperwork? The court docket alone would have been longer than the list of plagues in the Old Testament. The prosecution, likely seeing visions of a retirement spent individually cross-examining every last locust, had little choice but to concede defeat. The locusts were acquitted in a verdict that must have stung almost as much as a plague of incessant insects. So the next time you're tempted to gripe about a fly landing on your sandwich, just remember, at least that fly isn't lawyered up with legal representation. It could be a whole lot worse. You could be facing down a swarm of locusts in court, watching your crops disappear bite by bite as you await the verdict. But I digress. The long and short of it is this. For our medieval ancestors, the notion of animal free will and moral culpability ran surprisingly deep. Deep enough to land our furry and feathered friends in court facing down charges that would make the most hardened criminal wince. It all makes you wonder what else might have found itself in the medieval defendant's chair. A mischievous goat accused of vandalism, a lazy donkey charged with slacking on the job, a rooster crowing too early in the morn. In the end, perhaps we're lucky the only animal trials we have to contend with today are the ones involving two cute kittens and puppies vying for viral video supremacy. From locusts lawyering up to pigs going to the pen for their crimes, the weird world of medieval animal trials never ceases to astound. But as wacky as putting pests in prison might seem, it's far from the only outrageous notion to come out of the Middle Ages. You see, our medieval forebears had a bit of a complex relationship with the truth. For every genuine scientific insight or groundbreaking invention to come out of the era, there seemed to be an equal and opposite absurdity that took hold. And one of the most enduring myths of the Middle Ages is the idea that everyone back then thought the Earth was flat. We've all heard the apocryphal tale. The brave explorer Christopher Columbus defied the flat Earth dogma of his day and daringly set sail to prove the world was round. It's a tidy narrative, but there's just one problem. It's utter nonsense. You see, by Columbus's time in the 15th century, the idea of a spherical Earth was already old news. Ancient Greek thinkers like Pythagoras and Aristotle had cottoned onto the globe truth a good 2,000 years earlier. Heck, by around 240 BC, the Greek astronomer Eratosthenes had already calculated the Earth's circumference to within a few percent. That's some seriously well-rounded knowledge for supposedly flat-minded times. So, if any learned soul worth their salt already knew the Earth was more ball than board, what was Columbus's deal? Why all the flat Earth hubbub? Well, it turns out Columbus's real stroke of genius wasn't proving the Earth's curvature. It was proving his own talent for bending the truth. You have to remember, Columbus was a man on a mission. He was convinced he could reach the riches of Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. The trouble was, the naysayers were convinced Columbus would fall off the edge of the world trying. At least, that's how the story goes. In reality, Columbus's critics were less worried about the world ending and more concerned with the sheer distance of the journey. They simply, and rightly, thought he was lowballing how far it would be to reach Asia based on an underestimate of the Earth's size. Little did they know, Columbus had a trick up his sleeve to navigate their nagging concerns. In one of history's boldest bluffs, Columbus managed to convince the Spanish crown to back his venture by doing what all good gamblers do. He doubled down on his story. Knowing his voyage would be a tough sell, Columbus simply cherry-picked the lowest possible estimate for the Earth's circumference, effectively shrinking the globe to a more manageable size. It was a masterful manipulation. By making the world seem smaller, Columbus made his voyage appear far less daunting. Instead of a death-defying odyssey into the unknown, suddenly Columbus was selling a pleasure cruise to the provinces of Asia. All he needed was a little royal rubber stamping to get his expedition underway. And so, in perhaps the greatest geographic grift of all time, Columbus set sail in 1492 with the blessing and bankrolling of the Spanish monarchy. But Columbus' truth-bending didn't stop there. No, he was just getting started. As Columbus and his crew plunged headlong into uncharted waters, the days at sea began to stack up like so many waves on the horizon. Mile after mile, league after league, the wide expanse of the Atlantic stretched on without end. At least not the end Columbus had promised his increasingly homesick men. With each passing day, Columbus's crew grew more restless, more doubtful of their captain's bold assurances. Knowing his ship was sailing straight into the teeth of a mutiny, Columbus reached into his bag of tricks once more. It was time to get creative with the truth. Faced with the terrifying prospect of being thrown overboard by his own men, Columbus began a dangerous game. Each night, he would surreptitiously log 2 distances in his captain's journal, one reflecting the actual distance traveled that day, and one, well, substantially less than that. Columbus knew if his crew discovered just how far they had sailed without a whiff of land in sight, he'd be fish food faster than you could say, Marco Polo. So each evening, Columbus would emerge from his quarters and boldly announce the official distance for the day, a number carefully fudged low enough to keep his crew from calling his bluff. It was a risky gambit, but ultimately it paid off. Columbus managed to string along his crew long enough to bump into the Bahamas, a locale decidedly not Asia, but certainly far enough west to save Columbus's bacon. The plucky explorer would get to make not 1, not 2, but 4 round-trip voyages to the Americas, never quite reaching that original promised destination. So the next time you hear someone spinning a yarn about Columbus bravely disproving the flat Earth dogma, feel free to chime in with the facts. The only thing flat in Columbus's world was his learning curve for underestimating the Earth's size. But what the man lacked in geographical accuracy, he more than made up for in sheer audacity and duplicity. For you see, Columbus's real legacy wasn't expanding our worldview or proving our planet's roundness. No, Columbus's true gift was his ability to swindle his way into the history books through a web of half-truths, white lies, and bald-faced bluffs. Forget the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Columbus's real flagship was a little vessel called Misdirection. But hey, in the end, Columbus reached a happy ending of sorts. He lived out his days as a celebrated, if somewhat confused, hero, never quite grasping the true nature of his discovery. And really, isn't that the medieval way? To stumble backwards into progress, fueled by a combination of ignorance, superstition, and dumb luck. From animal trials and imaginary devices to scientific nonsense and geographic grift, the Middle Ages were a time of great leaps forward and even greater steps sideways. But through it all, the human spirit endured, striving ever onward in the face of a world that seemed to grow stranger and more wondrous with each passing year. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to marvel at the medieval mind, to wonder at a world where insects could lawyer up and defend their right to eat, where a porous pig could find itself doing porridge for murder, a world where the edges of the map promised certain death, but the promise of glory proved too tempting to resist. Yes, our medieval ancestors may have gotten a lot of things wrong, but in their unending quest to make sense of a senseless world, they left behind a legacy of laughter, of wonder, and of enduring human spirit. And for that, we can all be grateful. So good night, my curious compatriots. May your dreams be filled with the stuff of medieval myth and mystery. May you sail boldly off the edge of the map, secure in the knowledge that the horizon is always just a little bit farther than we think. And may you greet each new day with the same sense of possibility and wonder that drove our medieval forebears to such dizzying heights of absurdity. After all, in a world where pigs can stand trial and the planet is a never-ending plain, anything is possible, even a good night's sleep. So from the bottom of my medieval heart, I bid you sweet dreams and a restful slumber. May the morrow bring you joy, laughter, and nary a mischievous goat to be found. Part 5. The Mouth Harp, for Jaws of Steel. As we delve deeper into the peculiar inventions of the Middle Ages, we come across a musical instrument that's sure to raise an eyebrow or two. Picture this: a small, unassuming metal instrument, no bigger than the palm of your hand. It consists of a flexible metal or bamboo tongue, fixed at one end to a frame. Behold, the mouth harp, also known as the Jew's harp or jaw harp. Now don't let its size fool you. The mouth harp may be small, but playing it is no small feat. To coax a tune out of this curious contraption, one must first clamp the frame between their teeth, leaving the tongue free to vibrate. Then, by either plucking the tongue with a finger or striking it with a tool, the musician sets the tongue a quiver. But here's where things get tricky. To change the pitch, the player must skillfully alter the shape and size of their oral cavity, all while maintaining a tight grip on the frame with their teeth. It's a delicate dance of jaw, tongue, and breath, a far cry from the more dignified postures of the lute or harp. But the mouth harp wasn't just a medieval party trick. Its roots stretch back far earlier and far further east. Archaeologists have unearthed mouth harps dating back to the 4th century BCE in Asia, suggesting a long and storied history for this humble instrument. From the steppes of Mongolia to the courts of medieval Europe, the mouth harp managed to pluck its way into the hearts of musicians across the globe. Yet, despite its wide-reaching influence, the mouth harp never quite managed to shake off its air of silliness. After all, it's hard to maintain a serious countenance when your cheeks are hollowed. your teeth are clenched, and your tongue is darting about like a fish out of water. Even the great Leonardo da Vinci couldn't resist capturing the comical visage of a mouth harp player. In a sketch dating back to 1481, da Vinci depicts a man mid-performance, his face contorted in a manner that's more caricature than portrait. It's a testament to the mouth harp's enduring ability to elicit a chuckle, even from one of history's most brilliant minds. But let's not write off the mouth harp as a mere medieval gag gift. In the right hands, or rather, the right mouth, this instrument is capable of producing an array of sounds, from twangy drones to intricate melodies. Its unique timbre has even found its way into modern music, featuring in everything from folk tunes to heavy metal tracks. Not bad for an instrument that looks like it belongs in a dentist's toolkit rather than a musician's arsenal. As we imagine a medieval minstrel plying their trade with a mouth harp, we can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. In a time when music was often a solemn affair, confined to the halls of castles and cathedrals, the mouth harp offered a playful respite. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity's capacity for humour and whimsy endures. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us tip our hats, or rather open our jaws, to the mighty mouth harp, a small but mighty testament to medieval ingenuity and silliness alike. Part 6. Animal Trials, Putting Pests in Prison. In our journey through the absurdities of the Middle Ages, we've encountered our fair share of bizarre inventions, but perhaps none are quite as perplexing as the practice of putting animals on trial. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, it wasn't uncommon for creatures of all kinds, from pigs to rats to locusts, to find themselves in the dock, facing charges that ranged from property damage to murder. On the surface, the idea of hauling a farm animal into court may seem like a joke. After all, how does one serve a subpoena to a swarm of locusts? Can a rat be held accountable for its actions? But for medieval jurists, these animal trials were no laughing matter. The proceedings were conducted with all the solemnity and formality of a human trial, complete with lawyers, jurors, and witnesses. Take, for example, the case of the weevils of Saint-Julien. In 1587, the tiny insects were put on trial for the crime of destroying local vineyards. The court appointed a lawyer to defend the weevils, who argued that the creatures were God's creation and therefore had a right to eat. The prosecution countered that the weevils' destruction of the vineyards was a threat to human survival. In the end, the court reached a compromise. The weevils were banished to a designated plot of land where they could munch away to their heart's content. But not all animal defendants were so lucky. In 1457, a rooster in Basel, Switzerland, found itself accused of a most heinous crime: laying an egg. According to medieval superstition, a rooster laying an egg was a sign of impending disaster, perhaps even a precursor to the Antichrist himself. The court took the matter seriously, putting the poor bird on trial and ultimately condemning it to death by fire. One can only imagine the confusion of the rooster as it was led to the stake, its last cluck a plea for mercy. It's easy to dismiss these animal trials as mere medieval quirks, a product of a time when superstition reigned supreme. But they also offer a window into the complex relationship between humans and animals in the Middle Ages. In a world where animals were seen as both property and moral agents, subject to the same laws and punishments as their human counterparts, the line between beast and man was blurrier than we might imagine. Moreover, these trials reflect a deeply held belief in the power of the law to regulate all aspects of life, from the loftiest of human affairs to the lowliest of creatures. In a time when the rule of law was still a fragile concept, the idea that even a rat could have its day in court was a powerful one, a testament to the reach and authority of the legal system. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the animals of the Middle Ages, those unwitting defendants in the court of human justice, May their trials and tribulations remind us of the strange and wonderful ways in which our ancestors grappled with the world around them, and the enduring power of the law to shape our understanding of the natural order. And may we never find ourselves in the dock, defending our right to lay an egg or munch a vineyard. Part 7. The Flat Earth, Columbus's Big Bluff. As we near the end of our journey through the worst inventions of the Middle Ages, we come to perhaps the most enduring myth of all, the idea that Christopher Columbus proved the Earth was round. It's a tale as old as grade school history books, a story of one man's bravery in the face of a world that believed the Earth was flat. But here's the thing, it's all a big, fat lie. You see, by the time Columbus set sail in 1492, the idea of a spherical Earth was already old news. The ancient Greeks had figured it out centuries earlier, using a combination of observation and mathematical reasoning. By the Middle Ages, the Earth's roundness was accepted as fact by scholars and navigators alike. So why, then, do we still cling to the myth of Columbus as the great debunker of flat Earth thinking? The answer lies not in Columbus's navigational prowess, but in his skills as a master manipulator. You see, Columbus had a grand plan to secure funding for a voyage to the East Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic. The problem was, his calculations were way off. He grossly underestimated the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia, believing that a westward route would be much shorter than it actually was. To convince the Spanish crown to bankroll his voyage, Columbus had to get creative. He played up the promise of untold riches in the East, tantalizing the monarchs with tales of spices, silk, and gold. But he also had to downplay the risks of the journey, which is where the flat Earth myth comes in. By casting himself as a lone visionary, bravely setting out to prove the Earth's roundness against the naysayers and doubters, Columbus positioned himself as a hero of rationality and progress. In reality, Columbus's contemporaries weren't skeptical of his voyage because they thought the Earth was flat. They were skeptical because they knew the Earth was much larger than Columbus claimed, and they feared he and his crew would run out of food and water long before reaching Asia. And they were right. Columbus drastically misjudged the distance, and if not for the lucky happenstance of the Americas lying in his path, he and his men would have surely perished. But Columbus's bluff paid off. He secured the funding, made the voyage, and the rest is history. And yet, the myth of Columbus as the lone crusader against flat Earth ignorance persists, a testament to the power of a good story over the truth. It's a reminder that sometimes the most enduring inventions are not the ones that solve problems or make life easier, but the ones that capture our imaginations and shape our understanding of the world. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, let us ponder the curious case of Christopher Columbus, the great navigator who got lost, the great visionary who couldn't do math, and the great debunker of a myth that never was. May his story remind us to always question the tales we're told, and to never underestimate the power of a persuasive pitch. And may we dream of a world where truth trumps fiction, where progress is measured not in myths and legends, but in the steady march of knowledge and understanding. Good night, and sweet dreams of a round and wondrous Earth. Conclusion. And so, our whimsical journey through the worst inventions of the Middle Ages comes to a close. From the macabre dance of death to the silly songs of the mouth harp, from the imaginary chastity belts to the all-too-real animal trials, we've seen the medieval mind at its most absurd and its most inventive. It's easy to look back on these follies and foibles with a sense of superiority, to laugh at the strange beliefs and practices of a bygone era. But in truth, the medieval world was not so different from our own. Then as now, people grappled with the great questions of life and death, of faith and reason, of power and justice. And then, as now, they sometimes came up with answers that were a bit off the mark. But that's the beauty of human ingenuity, isn't it? Even in our darkest and most difficult times, we never stop dreaming, never stop creating, never stop reaching for something new and better. Sure, sometimes those creations are a bit misguided, looking at you, Mumia. But other times, they're the seeds of something truly remarkable. Something that changes the world in ways we could never have imagined. So, let us not judge the inventors and innovators of the Middle Ages too harshly. Let us instead marvel at their creativity, their curiosity, and their unending quest for knowledge and understanding. And let us take inspiration from their example, even as we learn from their mistakes. As you drift off to sleep, dear listener, may your dreams be filled not with the terrors of the danse macabre or the horrors of the animal trials, but with the wonder and whimsy of a world that is always changing, always growing, always finding new ways to surprise and delight us. May you wake refreshed and ready to face the day, armed with the knowledge that no matter how dark the times may seem, the human spirit will always find a way to shine through. Good night, and sweet dreams of a world that is round and rich and endlessly fascinating. A world that is always waiting to be explored and understood anew. May the worst inventions of the Middle Ages be but a distant memory, and may the best be yet to come. As we drift deeper into the curious corners of medieval history, one can't help but marvel at the ingenuity of our ancestors, even if that ingenuity sometimes ventured into the realm of the absurd. From morbid motifs to macabre medicines, the Middle Ages were rife with inventions that, to our modern sensibilities, seem downright ridiculous. And yet, there's something oddly fascinating about these unconventional creations, a testament to the enduring human spirit of innovation, no matter how misguided. Take, for instance, the peculiar practice of putting animals on trial. Yes, you heard that right. In medieval Europe, it wasn't uncommon for creatures of all kinds to find themselves in the dock, facing charges for their supposed crimes. Pigs, rats, locusts, and even roosters were hauled before the court, complete with lawyers, jurors, and witnesses, all participating in a legal farce that seems laughable today. One of the most famous cases of an animal trial took place in 1457 in the Swiss town of Basel. The unlikely defendant? A rooster, accused of the heinous crime of laying an egg. Now, as any modern biologist can tell you, roosters are physically incapable of producing eggs. But try telling that to the good people of Basel, who were convinced this cockerel had committed an act of devilry. The rooster's trial was a spectacle to behold. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and the bird's lawyer mounted a spirited defense, arguing that his client was merely a humble servant of God, not some unholy demon spawn. But alas, the prosecution's case was too strong, and the poor rooster was found guilty as charged. His sentence, death by burning at the stake, a fate usually reserved for witches and heretics. As the flames consumed the unfortunate bird, one can only imagine the sense of satisfaction felt by the townspeople of Basel. Justice had been served, and the natural order of things had been restored. Never mind that they had just executed an innocent animal for a biological impossibility. In the eyes of medieval law, the rooster had gotten what it deserved. But the absurdity of animal trials didn't end with our egg-laying rooster friend. Throughout the Middle Ages, all manner of creatures found themselves in legal hot water. In 1474, a pig in France was tried and executed for the murder of a child. In 1519, a horde of rats in the Italian town of Autun were summoned to court for destroying local barley crops. And in 1587, a swarm of locusts in Valence were put on trial for wreaking havoc on the region's vineyards. These trials may seem like the height of ridiculousness to us today, but they reflect a deeper truth about medieval attitudes toward animals. In a world where the line between human and beast was often blurred, where animals were seen as moral agents capable of sin and salvation, it made a strange sort of sense to hold them accountable for their actions, just like any other member of society. Of course, the notion of animal trials wasn't universally accepted, even in the Middle Ages. Some theologians and legal scholars argued that animals lacked the reason and free will necessary to be held liable for their actions. Others pointed out the logical inconsistencies of putting creatures on trial, given their inability to understand human language or the intricacies of the law. But for the most part, animal trials persisted throughout the medieval period, a testament to the power of superstition and the human need to find order in a chaotic world. It wasn't until the Age of Enlightenment that the practice finally fell out of favour, as a new generation of thinkers challenged the old ways of understanding the natural world. Today, we can look back on the phenomenon of animal trials with a mix of amusement and bemusement, a reminder of just how far we've come in our understanding of the animal kingdom. And yet, there's something oddly endearing about the idea of a rooster standing trial, a pig taking the stand, or a swarm of locusts facing judgment for their crimes. In a world that often feels all too serious, there's a certain charm to these moments of medieval whimsy, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could still find room for the absurd. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those strange and silly times when roosters laid eggs and rats had their day in court. And take comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how ridiculous things may seem, the spark of human creativity and innovation will always find a way to shine through, even if it sometimes takes the form of a pig in the dock. But animal trials weren't the only absurdity to come out of the Middle Ages. As we delve deeper into the annals of history, we find ourselves face to face with one of the most enduring myths of the medieval period: the notion that Christopher Columbus, the famed explorer, was the first to prove that the Earth was round. It's a tale that's been told time and time again. How Columbus, armed with nothing but his wits and his unwavering belief in a spherical Earth, set out to challenge the flat Earth orthodoxy of his time. How he convinced the Spanish crown to fund his voyages, promising a faster route to the riches of the East. And how, through his daring and determination, he finally proved to the world that the Earth was not, in fact, a flat disk, but a glorious globe waiting to be explored. It's a stirring story, to be sure, but it's also complete and utter nonsense. The truth is, by the time Columbus set sail in 1492, the idea of a spherical Earth had been widely accepted among educated Europeans for centuries. Ancient Greek scholars like Aristotle and Ptolemy had long since established the Earth's roundness through observation and logical deduction, and their ideas had been passed down through the ages by Islamic and Christian thinkers alike. So why then do we continue to cling to the myth of Columbus as the great flat Earth debunker? Part of it, no doubt, has to do with the man's own self-aggrandizing tendencies. Columbus, it seems, was a master of self-promotion, spinning tales of his own genius and bravery to anyone who would listen. In his letters and journals, he repeatedly claimed to have proven the Earth's roundness through his voyages, conveniently ignoring the fact that this was already common knowledge among the learned elite. But Columbus's true innovation, it could be argued, was not his supposed proof of a spherical Earth, but rather his skill as a master manipulator. For you see, Columbus was a man with a plan to secure funding for his ambitious voyages to the East. And to do that, he needed to convince the Spanish crown that his idea was not only feasible, but profitable. So Columbus set to work, spinning a web of exaggerations and half-truths designed to sway the monarchs in his favour. He claimed, for instance, that the distance between Europe and Asia was much shorter than it actually was, and that a westward route would be far faster and easier than the traditional overland journey. He also played up the potential for riches and glory, promising the Spanish rulers vast troves of gold, spices, and other valuable goods just waiting to be claimed. In the end, Columbus's gambit paid off. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, swayed by his grandiose promises and his sheer force of personality, agreed to fund his voyages. And so, in August of 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain with 3 small ships and a crew of intrepid adventurers, ready to make history. But Columbus's penchant for manipulation didn't end there. As he and his crew ventured further and further into uncharted waters, Columbus found himself facing a new challenge, keeping his men motivated and on course. With no land in sight and supplies running low, the crew grew restless and mutinous, threatening to turn back and abandon the mission. Faced with this crisis, Columbus once again turned to his talents as a master manipulator. He began to lie to his crew about the distances they had traveled, claiming they had come much farther than they actually had. He also played up the promise of riches and glory waiting just over the horizon, painting a picture of a lush and bountiful land that would make all their hardships worthwhile. Through a combination of deception and sheer force of will, Columbus managed to keep his crew in line and on course. And when they finally did make landfall in October of 1492, it was not in the East Indies as Columbus had promised, but rather on the shores of a brand new world, the Americas. In the end, Columbus's legacy is a complex one. On the one hand, he was undoubtedly a skilled navigator and a brave explorer, willing to venture into the unknown in pursuit of his dreams. But on the other hand, he was also a ruthless colonizer, responsible for the enslavement and exploitation of countless indigenous peoples in the New World. And of course, there is the enduring myth of Columbus as the great flat Earth debunker. A myth that, while thoroughly debunked by modern scholarship, continues to persist in the popular imagination. Perhaps it speaks to our desire for a simple, heroic narrative. The idea of one man standing up against the ignorance of his time and proving the truth through sheer force of will. But the reality, as is so often the case, is far more complex. Columbus may have been a master manipulator, but he was no flat Earth visionary. And while his voyages did indeed change the course of history, they were not the unqualified triumph of reason over superstition that the myth would have us believe. As you drift off to sleep, ponder these complexities, the ways in which our understanding of the past is shaped by the stories we tell ourselves, and the ways in which even the most enduring myths can be challenged and overturned by the light of historical truth. And take comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how great the deception or how deep the ignorance, the human spirit will always strive for greater understanding, even if it sometimes takes a few centuries to get there. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through the worst inventions of the Middle Ages, let us take a moment to reflect on all that we've learned. From the morbid fascinations of the danse macabre to the bizarre quackery of powdered mummy medicine, from the jaw-aching absurdity of the mouth harp to the outright silliness of animal trials, the medieval period was a time of great contrasts. A time when the human spirit could soar to great heights of creativity and ingenuity, even as it wallowed in the depths of superstition and ignorance. But perhaps that is the great lesson of medieval history, that even in the darkest of times, the spark of human curiosity and invention could not be extinguished. Yes, our ancestors may have believed in flat earths and egg-laying roosters, but they also built soaring cathedrals and intricate clocks, composed haunting melodies and stirring epics, and laid the foundations for the modern world we know today. And so, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those strange and distant times when the world was a little darker, a little more mysterious, and a little more absurd. Let yourself be lulled by the soft strains of the mouth harp, the gentle clacking of the chastity belt and the soothing whispers of the danse macabre. And know that no matter how ridiculous or how sublime, the inventions of the past are always with us, shaping our present and guiding us into the future. Good night, dear listener, and sweet medieval dreams. May your slumbers be filled with visions of mummies and monkeys, pigs and popes, and all the glorious absurdities of a world long gone, but never forgotten. For in the end, it is the very strangeness of history that makes it so endlessly fascinating. A reminder that, no matter how far we may have come, we are all still human, still fallible, and still capable of both the ridiculous and the sublime. So rest now, and let the worst inventions of the Middle Ages carry you off to a land of wonder and whimsy, where the impossible becomes possible, and the absurd becomes the everyday. And may you wake in the morning with a newfound appreciation for the marvels and the mysteries of the past, and a renewed sense of the boundless potential of the human spirit in all its strange and glorious forms. As we've seen, the medieval period was rife with questionable inventions and absurd ideas masquerading as innovation. But perhaps one of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages is the notion that people widely believed the Earth was flat. In reality, this is a misconception that has been debunked by historians time and time again. The idea of a spherical Earth dates back to ancient Greece, with philosophers like Aristotle and Ptolemy providing compelling evidence for a round planet. This knowledge was never lost during the medieval period, and the scholars of the time were well aware of the Earth's true shape. In fact, it was a common belief among the educated classes of medieval Europe. So why do we associate the flat Earth theory with the Middle Ages? Much of this stems from the story of Christopher Columbus and his infamous voyage across the Atlantic. Legend has it that Columbus was a brave visionary who defied the backward thinking of his time and set out to prove the Earth was round. But this tale is nothing more than a piece of historical fiction. In truth, Columbus's real innovation was not his belief in a spherical Earth, but rather his skills as a master manipulator. You see, Columbus was convinced that he could reach Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic. But there was a problem with his calculations. He vastly underestimated the size of the Earth and the distance to the east coast of Asia. Most scholars at the time rightly rejected Columbus's proposal, not because they believed in a flat Earth, but because they knew his math was way off. Undeterred, Columbus took his pitch to the Spanish crown, where he wove a tantalizing tale of the riches that awaited in the Far East. Through sheer persistence and salesmanship, he eventually convinced Queen Isabella to fund his expedition. But Columbus's deceptions didn't end there. Once his voyage was underway, he consistently lied to his crew about the distances they had traveled. He knew that if the sailors discovered just how far off course they were, they might mutiny and turn back. So he kept two sets of logs, one with the true distances and another with shorter distances to show the crew. It was a risky gambit, but it paid off when they eventually landed in the Bahamas. In the end, Columbus didn't discover a new route to Asia or prove the Earth was round. His real feat was swindling the Spanish monarchy and deceiving his own crew to keep his far-fetched voyage on track. It's a testament to his skills as a conman, but hardly the stuff of heroic legend. So the next time someone tries to tell you that Columbus bravely defied the flat Earth beliefs of his time, you can set the record straight. The real story is far less noble, but perhaps more intriguing. A tale of a master manipulator who peddled his own fictions to achieve his goals. As we come to the end of our journey through the worst inventions of medieval times, it's clear that human ingenuity takes many forms, some brilliant, some misguided, and some just plain absurd. From the morbid fad for mumia medicine to the silliness of animal trials, the Middle Ages were a time of great leaps and strange stumbles. But in a way, that's what makes this period so fascinating. For all its flaws and foibles, The medieval world was a crucible of innovation, a time when people were striving to make sense of their world and improve their lot in life. Some of their efforts were successful, some were silly, and some were simply bizarre. But they all reflect the enduring human drive to create, to explore, and to understand. So as you drift off to sleep, ponder these medieval marvels and mishaps. Let your mind wander through the twisting streets of a medieval town, past the macabre frescoes of the Danse Macabre and the clinking workshops of chastity belt forgers. Imagine the echoes of a mouth harp playing a jaunty tune, or the frantic squeaking of a rat on trial for its life. These vignettes may be absurd, but they are also strangely endearing, reminders of a time when the world was still vast and mysterious, and people were grappling with the big questions of life, death, and everything in between. So embrace the silliness and the strangeness, and let these medieval tales carry you off to a land of dreams. And if you've enjoyed our whimsical tour through the worst inventions of the Middle Ages, we humbly invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We promise to keep bringing you the most boring and sleep-inducing history content we can muster. Until next time, sweet dreams and good night.